Let's start by thinking about some preliminary things that strike us as different about Euripides from the other two. It's not as clear from the Bacchae, but I mean, the Bacchae is sometimes called the Bacchae, sometimes called the Bacchantes, and sometimes called the Bacchants, which is, I think, what your translation reads. It's the same word in Greek. They're the followers of Bacchus in the plural. Now, some preliminary things, again, that strike us as different. His drama seems closer to our drama. It's not something you'd see on TV, but it's closer to that than, certainly than Aeschylus and really than Sophocles as well. The use of the chorus decreases in Euripides, not as obviously in the Bacchae, but in other plays, but even in the Bacchae, there are more characters. And the songs are more often not simply stasima, not simply the chorus in the orchestra singing and dancing by itself, but interchanges between the chorus and characters on the stage. So, I mean, on a whole, you could say they seem to us more like real human beings. Nietzsche is very harsh on Euripides in The Birth of Tragedy. The charge he brings against him is that he brought the spectators on the stage. So in a way, the characters, there's a lot, it means much more than this in Nietzsche, but the place you begin in trying to understand it is that the characters on the stage are much more like us than they are in either Sophocles or Aeschylus. So on the one hand, it's more realistic. On the other hand, there are certain unrealistic devices that increase in their occurrences. So for example, in the extant plays, there are 7 by Sophocles, 7 by Aeschylus, and 18 by Euripides. In the extant plays, Sophocles and Aeschylus never begin with a prologue by a god to tell you exactly what's going to happen. In Euripides, a third of them begin that way, 6 out of 18. And in Sophocles and Aeschylus, in the 14 plays that they composed, only once is the Deus ex machina used. Deus ex machina just means the god from the machine, and we think that it was a crane-like device that lowered a character into the action from above, and it happens at the end of the play when a god comes in to tell you what's going to happen to everybody and say, well, so-and-so is going to do this, so-and-so is going to do that. We'll see that in the play the Euripides play we spend most time on, the Iphigenia among the Taurians. So only once in Sophocles and Aeschylus does that happen. That's in the Philoctetes, and even there, it's not clear whether it's a real god or it's Odysseus pretending to be a god. But in Euripides, it happens 8 times. The other thing that happens in Euripides is that he makes very obvious references within his plays to other plays. So for example, in his Electra, there's a recognition scene between Electra and Orestes in which the old tutor, in Greek, pedagogos, the one who leads the children, suggests that they look around the tomb and maybe they can find some footprints, or maybe there'll be a piece of cloth, or maybe some hair. And Electra goes on at great length showing how this is just an absurd understanding of what recognition means. So it's a direct criticism of the recognition scene in Aeschylus's Libation Bearers. So you could say Euripides has a tendency to call attention He does it more often and more explicitly than the other two to call attention to the tragedy itself as a poem, as a poema, as something made. And so his tragedies are, in a way, it's not that the others are not self-referential, they are, but Euripides' tragedies are more obviously self-referential. So you could say, if Aeschylus and Sophocles are modern in their invention of tragedy, because in a way it doesn't come into its own, that Sophocles makes changes. They're innovators, Aeschylus and Sophocles. If that's true of them, if they're modern, Euripides is postmodern. It is funny the way those terms get so. Not everybody agrees with this, but a lot of people think that the first novel was Don Quixote. And Don Quixote has two parts. The second part begins with Don Quixote worrying over the fact that someone has published a book about him that's entirely false. It's just, and it turns out that he's talking about part one of the book. So it's very funny, but it's also absolutely characteristic of what we would call postmodernism. So you need to be very, very careful when you talk about things like that, as though somehow the late 20th century invented postmodernism. It turns out that the very first novel is a postmodern novel. And we've discovered something like that all semester with tragedy. You'd think that, self-reflexivity, that notion that the book is both talking about the world and itself, and intertextuality in the sense that it's making references, that looks like modern stuff. It looks like what you expect to happen. What's the name of that book? I can't tell you because I've forgotten the name. But anyway, it looks like something that was written at the very earliest in maybe 1970. Maybe John Barth was. But it turns out that it's 2,500 years old, that they were as clever about things like this as we are. And so in a way, it's crucial to see that Euripides is doing that already. In this play especially, it's going to be very important for us. Now, the Bacchantes, the Bacchants, the Bacchae, is especially interesting in this sense. Dionysus, or Bacchus, is the god of the theater. And so the play in which he sets out to reveal himself turns out, as we will see, to be almost a tragedy about tragedy. It turns out, too, that half the time when I teach this course, always when I've taught it before in a full year, and the nice thing about that is that you can read the Iliad and the Odyssey and pretend they're tragedies, but also in group conference, you can do Aristotle's Poetics in the fall and Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy in the spring, and those are the two great philosophical works that are written explicitly about Greek tragedy, and they share an enormous amount, because in both of them, both Aristotle and Nietzsche are in a way using tragedy as a model to describe human action generally. So that turns out to be very interesting. Well, what's interesting about Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy is that it only takes, maybe a third of the book, if you've read the Bacchae, to realize that he's using it as a kind of model, even though the book as a whole is very, very critical of Euripides. Euripides is the source of the suicide of tragedy, the destruction of tragedy according to the Birth of Tragedy. But it also takes the form of the Bacchae in a lot of ways. One way is that Nietzsche defines tragedy as what he calls Apollinian form and Dionysian content. Very structured on the one hand, but a structure that is meant to give you a kind of turn on itself and be, in a way, very self-destructive. So it turns out that that's his description of how tragedy works. But then you look at the birth of tragedy itself, and you discover, oh my goodness, 25 chapters. First 10 chapters about the birth of tragedy. Second the chapters 11 through 15 about the death of tragedy at the hands of Euripides and then of Socrates. Final 10 chapters on the rebirth of tragedy. So it has this extraordinary structured character to it, even though its content is in a way meant to be a praise of the chaotic, you could say. So it turns out that Nietzsche writes a book which might be understood to be a tragedy about the death of tragedy. And it looks as though that's a very original thing to do. Nietzsche's, in a way, the first one we might acknowledge to be postmodern, except it turns out that Euripides has already done it in the Bacchae, and that Nietzsche knows that and is in some way imitating this, this self-reflexive character of Euripides' drama, which is really a tragedy about tragedy. Okay, so what happens in the play? It's not very complicated in a way. First, what happens before the play? So we know the story of the founding of Thebes by Cadmus, by killing the dragon and planting its seeds in the ground where Thebes is, and the initial Thebans grow up out of the planting of these teeth, these serpents' teeth. They are the original Spartoi. So Cadmus is the founder of Thebes, and he has several daughters with Harmonia, or sometimes called Hermione, the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. The daughters of Cadmus include Ino, Autonomy, Agave, and Semele. Now, these four figure, especially Agave and Semele, very prominently in the Bacchae. About the son that Cadmus and Harmonia had, Polydorus, who's the father of Labdacus, who's the father of Laius, who's the father of Oedipus, Euripides is really remarkably, strangely silent. Now, Semele is pregnant with Zeus's child and asks, before her child is born, to see her lover as he really is. Zeus shows himself to her face to face, and she's burnt to a cinder. You cannot look directly at the face of God. Her son, however, is saved by his father, taken by Zeus, placed in his knee, from which he's eventually born. The son's name, various names, Dionysus, Bacchus, Bromius, Iacchos, Evius. Almost all of these names occur at one point or another in our play. So, meanwhile, the family of Semele, with the possible exception of Cadmus, in this play we get a hint that he might be different from the rest of them, her family didn't believe her story. They thought that, in fact, she was pregnant, had had some kind of affair with someone, had said that she was carrying the child of Zeus, and in fact was killed, struck down by lightning because she was lying about a god. So Dionysus is not acknowledged to be a god in Thebes. Now, our play opens with Dionysus in the form of a human being telling us who he is and that his plan is to establish the religion that worships him in Greece. He's already done that in Asia. He's at the shrine of Semele at the beginning. I have a note here. I hope you've you've got the old version, right? So the pages are going to be wrong. How many have this one or something close? Well, it's hard to say from the cover. That's a good start. I think I'm going to have to give old and new pages again, which is not going to be happy, but here goes. I have a note to myself that I have to look at line 330 following. You don't get you get line numbers at the top of the page, but they don't give you line numbers up and down the page. It's on my page 325. In the older edition, it's 288. So I have this. Oh, that's 326. Okay. My boy, this is Cadmus. My boy Tiresias has advised you well. Dwell with us, do not break with our old ways. You are flighty at the moment. Your wisdom is unwise. He's talking to Pentheus. Even if this is no God, as you say, pretend to yourself that he is. It is a most honorable falsehood. It makes Semele seem to be the mother of a god, and it will redound to the credit of our whole family. So it looked, because Cadmus is all dressed up and he's going to go out and worship like a worshiper of Dionysus. It looks as though he believes it, but he makes it clear here that it's sort of a practical matter with him. It's better to do this than not. Okay, now Dionysus has come to Greece to found his religion there. He's followed by Asian women, bacchantes, revelers to Bacchus, who think he's a priest of Dionysus. This is the chorus. Now, to found his religion in Greece, he must first overcome the opposition to him in Thebes, where the current king, Pentheus, which means in Greek something like sorrowful one, forbids his worship. Now, Pentheus is the grandson of Cadmus, the son of Agave and Achaeon. Achaeon we know nothing about in this play. So the son of Agave and another one of the original Spartoi. So Pentheus and Dionysus are cousins. Now, the subsequent plot is pretty simple. In the absence of Pentheus, Dionysus has introduced the rites of his new religion. So the women of Thebes have all run off to the country where, depending on whom you listen to, they're either involved in sexual orgies or they're simply communing in various ways with nature. Cadmus and Tiresias are dressed up at the beginning to go participate as well. Pentheus then returns, having captured some of the women. He tells them, Cadmus and Tiresias, not to go, and then sets off to capture the stranger, the priest of Dionysus. He captures him and puts him in chains, but Dionysus' stranger escapes, and a series of wondrous events occur, none of which convince Pentheus to relent at all. Now, finally, Dionysus, appearing as the stranger, the priest, tempts Pentheus with the prospect of seeing these revelries. And that's the whole thing. This whole section is more than a little voyeuristic on Pentheus's part. But then the stranger tells him, in order to do that, he's going to have to go dressed up as a woman, and we've seen Pentheus quite proud from the very beginning of how manly he is. We're about halfway through the play now. Pentheus hasn't quite decided when they go in the house to talk about it, and when he comes out, he's completely converted. But we don't see what converted him. They then go to Mount Kithaeron, where Pentheus is literally ripped to pieces by the women of Thebes. His mother returns holding what she thinks in her frenzy to be a lion's head, but it's really her son's head. When the Bacchic frenzy finally wears off, she discovers to her horror what she has done. At the end, Dionysus appears as himself or in the same form he appeared earlier, we're not told. He tells Cadmus that he and Harmonia are to be exiled. They're going to turn into snakes. They're going to lead an Asian, at the head of an Asian army to invade Greece later. And Pentheus's mother, Agave, is also exiled. So that's the end of the play. What are we to make of all of this? Let's start with the prologue, which seems, I think, in its way, to point to the problem in the play. So if you look at the first line, something like, I have come, Zeus's child, back to the land of the Thebans. So I am Dionysus. So he comes as a god, child of Zeus, Dios Pais. But my form I have changed from divine to human as I come now to Dirce streams to the water of Ismenus. So he's changed himself into human form. I have come, child of Zeus, but I have come in the form of a human being. This is, in the first lines, is the first sign of what we get close to the, formulated close to the end of the play, line 1388, either line 3, page 353 or 312, where we get this. It's not quite translated correctly. The chorus ends by saying, not many are the forms of divine intervention, but many are the shapes of divinities. So that's in some way the issue that's going to dominate this play. Step back. Why has he come? What's his purpose? He tells us early on, line 20 to 22, everywhere else I have instituted my dances and my mysteries that my Godhead might be manifest to mortals. So in Asia, his dances and his religious rites have been enough to make him manifest to mortals. So there are certain cults, certain practices, and they're sufficient to get him worshipped. But apparently in Thebes, something else is necessary. So a little bit further down, line 39 to 42, this city must learn, whether it likes it or not, that it still wants initiation into my Bacchic rites. The cause of my mother Semele I must defend by proving to mortals that I am a god born to her by Zeus. So you could say, in a way, it's because Dionysus comes from Thebes that they don't believe him. For them, it's got to be more than practices and rituals. They actually have to believe that Semele had intercourse with Zeus. And Semele is their next door neighbor. So it's like, someone they knew. It would be as though you were expected, you were a believing Christian and you were expected to believe that somebody who lived down the street from you, named Mary, had a virgin birth. It's one thing to believe it in the abstract, but the person you went to grade school with, that's just much harder. Now, what gets in the way of this at Thebes? Look at line 43 through 48, either 282 or 318. Now Cadmus has bestowed the kingship and its rights upon his grandson Pentheus, change the translation a bit, who wars against the gods with respect to me. He thrusts me away from his offerings, and in his prayers nowhere makes mention of me. So because his cousin wars against him, Dionysus's plan is to point out to Pentheus to Pentheus and all the Thebans that he's a god. Only after that is he going to make himself manifest, show himself in other lands. Directly after that, I have settled things here to my, when I have settled things here to my satisfaction, I will direct my steps to another land and manifest myself. But he goes on in this way. If the city of the Thebans becomes enraged and tries to drive the Bacchantes from the mountain by force of arms, I shall lead my Maenads into battle against them. That is why I have assumed this mortal form, changing myself to look like a natural man. So if that happens, he's going to fight them. How? By leading his mad women and taking the form of a man to do it. So Pentheus's war against Dionysus, his theomachane, literally fighting a god, requires that Dionysus show himself as a god. He's got to show himself as what he is. But Pentheus's war against Dionysus' followers, we're told, requires that Dionysus conceal himself and show himself only in the nature of a man. Now, in the course of the play, Dionysus is going to succeed in keeping Pentheus from launching his attack on the followers of Dionysus. But he seems never to give up his disguise. So the plot of the play suggests something like this. Pentheus is going to get punished for not seeing through a disguise that was designed by Dionysus not to be seen through, even by the people who worship him and believe in him. So you could say the general problem is this. The worship of Dionysus is somehow at odds with the recognition of Dionysus. The chorus worship Dionysus by way of rites and dances, that is according to convention. So you see, for example, line 403 to 433 on page either 281 or 326. We get this. Oh, that I might come to Cyprus, Aphrodite's isle, where dwell the loves that soothe the hearts of men. This is the chorus. To Paphos, where the 100-mouthed streams of the barbarian river bring fruits without rain. Where stands Pieria, queen of beauty, seat of the muses, where the holy hill of Olympus stands. Thither take me, Bromius, divine Bromius, leading your Bacchic road. There the graces dwell, there dwells desire, there it is lawful, divinely lawful, for the Bacchantes to celebrate their orgies. The deity, Zeus's son, rejoices in festivals. He loves goddess Peace, who brings prosperity and cherishes youth. To rich and poor he gives in equal measure the blessed joy of wine. But he hates the man who has no taste for such things. To live a life of happy days and sweet and happy nights, in wisdom to keep his mind and heart aloof from overbusy men. Whatever the majority, the simple folk, believe and follow, that way I will always accept. This is in the mouths of his followers. if you jump ahead to line 890, which is on either 301 or 340, you get this. The gods are cunning or deceptive. They lie in wait a long march of time to map the impious. Above the established doctrines, neither knowledge nor practice should seek to go. It costs but little to believe in the power and mystery of the gods, to accept what is grounded in nature and accepted by the usage of long ages. Now, the chorus also never see him. They only ever hear him. And when they see him only as the stranger. When they hear him, you get 577 to 90. You get this on page 331 or 293. Voice. Ho, hear me, hear my voice. Ho, Bacchants, ho, Bacchants. And then later down, ho, ho, again I call, Semele's child. And so this happens 4 times in succession. Pentheus eventually comes to obey Dionysus, but when he submits to him in the form of a bull. Again, on page 340, line 920, we get this, or page 301. I seem to see 2 suns and a double Thebes, 2 7-gated cities, and a bull is leading me on. You seem to be a bull with horns growing on your head. Were you ever an animal? Certainly you have the look of a bull. So, although the play starts with Dionysus at the still smoldering remains where his mother was struck by Zeus for wanting to see him face to face, Dionysus doesn't seem to realize that this is also a limitation on him, what it means to be recognized, what it means to be identified. So it looks as though Dionysus has set himself the task of doing what Zeus couldn't do. This seems clear from line 465, either 328 or 290, where we get this. Stranger, I am from there. Lydia is my fatherland. How come you bring these rites to Hellas? Dionysus initiated me, Zeus's son. Is there a Zeus over there who begets new gods? No, he's the same Zeus who joined in wedlock here with Semele. Was it by night or eye to eye that he necessitated you? Stranger, seeing the one seeing, he gave me sacred rites. So this is in a way a vindication of Dionysus's mother. If it's really possible to do what he's setting out to do, then she didn't have to be burned up. Now, just how difficult seeing a god is comes out quite beautifully on line 616 following, either page 294 or 332, where we get this. This is one of my favorite parts. This is the stranger. Thereto I mocked him. He thought he was binding me, he's talking to the chorus, binding me, but he never so much as laid a finger on me. He fed on fancy. In the stable where he took me to imprison me, he found a bull, and he threw his nooses around its knees and the hooves of its feet. He panted furiously and dripped sweat from his body and dug his teeth into his lips. There I was, sitting nearby at my ease and looking on. At this moment, Bacchus came and shook the building. He says this, of course, because he's talking to the chorus, and they think that he's a priest of Dionysus. They don't know that he's Dionysus. Came and shook the building and kindled a fire on his mother's tomb. Seeing the glare, Pentheus thought the place was on fire and rushed back and forth, ordering the servants to bring buckets of water. Every slave was busy at this task, but they had their trouble for nothing. Then he thought I had escaped, so he suspended these labors and rushed into the house with his dark sword drawn. But Bromius, Dionysus, as it seems to me, I give you my conjecture, created a phantom, a phasma, in the court. Pentheus attacked it with a rush and stabbed at the bright ether as if he were butchering me. Besides this, Bacchus brings these other afflictions on him. The prison he razed to the ground, everything lies in ruin. Most bitterly he must rue my imprisonment. Fatigue has made him drop his sword, and he lies exhausted. A mere man, he had the effrontery to join battle with a god. I slipped quietly out of the house and have come to you. I care nothing for Pentheus. So what have we got? We have at least 4 Dionysuses here, at least. There's the one speaking to the chorus. He's disguised as a priest of Dionysus. And then there's the one who shook the building. And then there's the apparition that Pentheus flails at, the phasma. And then there's the god that made it look, that made this last one look like the priest. And actually that leaves out the bull. So there really seem to be 5 of them. Now, Pentheus confuses the third one and the first one. So the phasma, the illusion, and the stranger. But the first is a disguise for the second. The first, namely the one we see on the stage, is a disguise for the one that shakes the house. But then it turns out that the illusion that gets generated is in a way no more an illusion than the one we take, the one we're looking at. So we think that when Dionysus steps on the stage at the beginning and tells us he's a god, that we have sort of the inside track on this god identification business, but that's strange in a way. We really need to see that it's much, much harder than that, because there's no reason to believe that the god Pentheus went after with his sword isn't the real one, and our stranger the illusion, because the stranger has admitted that he's an illusion. So it turns out that he's taken on the nature of a man, and what Pentheus goes after is something that is an appearance that looks like the one that we take to be the real Dionysus. And it's interesting, if you look at line 286 to 97, on either page 287 or 324, it becomes clear that Hera couldn't even tell the difference. This is complicated. We'll go through it more carefully next time. But we're told that but Zeus contrived a counter device, as a god might. He broke off a piece, a part, a meros there with an epsilon. He broke off a meros of the earth enveloping sky and gave jealous Hera, he's trying to do something with the pun, and it's almost impossible. We have a bunch of words here. So he broke off a piece of earth, and the piece there is a meros. And then he made what is called a hostage, or sort of a substitute, which in Greek is a ho meros. And then that's the one that is a copy, and Hera can't tell it from the real thing. And so it's a replacement. But the interesting thing is, of course, if they had capitals and you had Homeros, it's Homer. So, as I said, I think we should come back to this the next time, but he's doing something with puns here that we will need to understand. But right now, I think it's important, it's enough to see that we first see that Hera, not even Hera, a goddess can tell the difference. And then we look at page 332 or 294, it's at line 628, and it's not even clear that Dionysus can tell the difference. But Bromius, as it seems to me, namely Dionysus, I give you my conjecture as Dionysus created a phantom. So if you take that seriously, he's talking to the chorus, of course, but he's telling the chorus that he doesn't know whether the phantom, it's his guess, his conjecture that the phantom was a phantom, but of course, he's Dionysus. So does this mean that Dionysus really doesn't know whether he made an image of an image? Or is it only for the chorus? And both the fourth version of Dionysus and the third, the last two, exist only in this speech because he's telling them about it. We don't ever see it. And were made up by him for them. But if it turns out that even Dionysus doesn't know what Dionysus really is, then is it so clear that we should blame Pentheus? And is it so clear that Dionysus is a god? And if Dionysus does know what Dionysus is, but he feigns not knowing it for the sake of the chorus, then he too is only an appearance, an image of Dionysus. The only Dionysus left, when you sort of work out all the quirks in this list that he gives us, would be the one whom we never see and know only by what he does, by the house shaking. So what Pentheus says at line 465 following on page 328 or 290 is really, it seems sensible. He asks Dionysus, he asks the man who seems to be a priest of Dionysus, how do you know these rights that you have? And he's told by the stranger, Dionysus himself gave them to me face to face as proof. So Pentheus says, okay, show me them, these rights. And he gets the reply, well, I can't show you because they're top secret, and only people who are the followers of Dionysus can see them. Okay, what was Dionysus like? Well, he was like anything he wanted to be. So it looks as though Pentheus can't know before he's initiated. He can't get the answer to any of these questions, and he refuses to be initiated before he gets the answers to the questions. There seems then to be a tension, a necessary tension, an irreconcilable tension between believing, which involves the various rituals that you go through, and knowing, which involves genuine recognition. Now, the way out of this difficulty is clearly the works. Dionysus too, the one who shook the house, who's known by way of the terrible, miraculous, wondrous things that he does. Now, we're given 7 of these wonders or miracles. They're either experienced by Pentheus or reported to him. The thing starts on page either 327 or 290, it's line 448, where we get this. Is it? Hold it. That's not what I want. Huh. 448. On the other hand, those Bacchants you caught and shut up in public jail are gone. They slipped the bonds that bound them and gambled off to the meadows, calling upon Bromius as their god. The fetters of their feet burst asunder of their own accord, and the gates were unbarred by no mortal hand. This man who has come to our Thebes is full of wonders. The rest is your affair. So the Bacchants who were chained up in prison are magically freed. We don't get any response at all from Pentheus about this. And then, second of the wonders, Dionysus, or the stranger, Dionysus I, who is the stranger, escapes his bonds. Pentheus, at line 642 following, is puzzled, but he doesn't wait for any sort of answer as to how it happened. The palace burns and some beams collapse. That's the third of the wonders. Pentheus calls his servants, but he quickly loses interest himself. And then we get at line 702 following, either page 335 or 296, we get this rather startling account. These were young mothers who had left their infants behind and still had their breasts swollen with milk. Then they put on ivy wreaths and crowns of oak and flowery smilax. One took her thyrsus and struck it against a rock, and there sprang from it a dewy stream of water. Another struck her fennel wand upon the ground, and the god sent up a fountain of wine for her. Those that had a desire for the white drink scraped the earth with the tips of their fingers and had a rich store of milk. From the wands of ivy there dripped sweet streams of honey. If you had been there to see, you would have approached with prayers the god whom you now revile. So Pentheus has no response at all to this. And then, in what is probably the most extraordinary thing, at the set time, is maybe 10 lines down, they waved the thyrsus for their reveling and all together with one voice invoked Bacchus, Zeus's offspring Bromius. The whole mountain cried Bacchus with them. The animals joined in the revelry, and then change your translation, and with their motion, all things moved. So this is really extraordinary and unprecedented in Greek literature. To put it sort of bluntly, a mountain dances, Pentheus is utterly unaffected by this fact. Then we hear about the rout of Pentheus's men and the utter destruction of a village. And the last two marvels only convince Pentheus that the women could have been resisted if he had sent his heavy armed troops in, his hoplite troops. So Euripides has made Pentheus an unusually stubborn man. Somehow he's in a different world. But I think we need to do this. Imagine Pentheus coming into a performance of the Bacchae after the prologue without any explanation from Dionysus. We imagine mountains moving and the rest because we're told that it happened, but Pentheus sees stage tricks. He sees machines behind the gods. Without even thinking about it, we have to be seeing, when Dionysus walks out, we see three people. There's on the one hand Dionysus, that's who he tells us he is. And then on the other hand, he tells us he's taken the form of the nature of a man. So we see a man disguised as Dionysus. But if we think about it for a minute, we realize that, in fact, there's a third Dionysus, there's a third person, there's a man, an actor, disguised as Dionysus, disguised as a man. To make sense of things, we have to accept these rituals, these conventions of the theater. We have to willingly suspend our disbelief. But Pentheus hasn't been given any prologue. He didn't buy a ticket. He just walked in and he's looking at what to him is reality. No explanation. He's simply supposed to accept it as real. But why should he? It's instructive that Dionysus convinces Pentheus to accept it off stage. They go into the house. He's only barely entertaining the possibility that he's been told the truth. As soon as he comes out, he is a full believer. We have no idea what transpires. This conversation takes the form of getting him to dress up and take a role in the drama. So we haven't really solved anything today. I think that really I wanted to do only one thing. This whole movement is somehow the key to understanding the play. That is, Dionysus's superiority to Zeus consists in his being the god of the theater. Look on either 337 or 229, and you get this wonderful version, bottom of 337. Stranger. Would you like to see them in their gatherings upon the mountain? Very much. Aye, and pay unaccounted gold for the pleasure. Why have you fallen into a great Eros? Though it would pain me to see them drunk with wine, the stranger, yet it would please you to see what is a pain to you. Does that remind you of anything? I would pay a price. What do you get for paying a price? Well, it would pain me to see them drunk with wine, yet it would please you to see what is a pain to you. It will turn out that he is sitting, when he watches them, he's sitting on the side of a hill. That's, of course, you know all that because you're watching them put in this thing, this marble thing over near Westlands, right? That's sort of a mini Greek theater. But originally they just sat on the side of a hill. So what have we got? I mean, this is Euripides saying that, in fact, Dionysus is the god of the theater. He is trying to, he's the god of the theater and the god of wine and various other things. But for us, the important thing is the god of the theater. Pentheus doesn't believe him. The big issue is what it means to look at a god, whether it's going to burn you up. It burned up Semele when she tried to look directly at Zeus. Dionysus says, I'm better than Zeus. I can outdo Zeus. They can look, presumably that means they can look directly at me. But what does it mean to look directly at the god of fakery, at the god of appearance? It looks as though it has something to do with what he does when he seduces Pentheus to dress up, pay a price, come sit on the side of a hill, and enjoy the sight of things that pain him. So what we need to do, I mean, this is all a setup to try to give you some indication of why I think the play is most importantly about tragedy and about the role of tragedy and about the power of tragedy. But we still don't quite understand what he means us to take away from this, what the importance of this is. And for that, I think we need to look at the rest of the play. But that he's somehow doing that, I think is clear from what we've seen so far. Well, I mean, I think it relates powerfully in the sense that you could say, you remember that passage early in the Poetics when Aristotle makes clear that we even take pleasure from the depiction, the imitations of what he calls strangely dishonorable beasts. And I mentioned at the time that I thought that that was an interesting image for what tragedy does. So pity and fear, you in a way, what Aristotle means is that you couldn't be, you couldn't pity them unless you somehow shared their fear and understood it, but you can't fear to the extent they fear, and therefore you are also detached from the fear. You take pity on them. That places you in a position of detachment and, in a way, superiority, and you take pleasure in that detachment. So it turns out that this is the way Dionysus seduces Pentheus, whose name means sorrowful one, into becoming a spectator. He has an erotic drive to look at suffering, you could say. It's a powerful way of describing what overtakes us when we're watching, when we're watching a tragedy. If we're into it, we have an almost erotic drive to see it through, and we take pleasure in what we see, in a way, because it's so painful. If it were less perfectly painful, we'd have less pleasure in it. So all of that, I think, is a setup to show you that what's at stake is the power of tragedy to reveal to us indirectly what cannot be revealed to us directly, because if you look directly at it, it's going to burn you up. So we're experimenting with the possibility of worshiping the god of indirectness as a way to look directly at the gods. What does it mean to worship the god of indirection? That's a tricky god, very different from Zeus. It's why perhaps he's an Olympian, like Ares and Apollo and the rest of them, but the last born. He's peculiar as an Olympian god. Now, what we need to keep in mind is this is a setup, but it does also turn out that Pentheus is punished at the end of this. Nobody comes out very well at the end, so it's not as though Pentheus learns how to worship Dionysus and this saves him. Doesn't save him. It doesn't save his mother. Doesn't save Cadmus and Harmonia. So we don't quite know where he's going with it yet, but it does look as though we know what the vehicle is that he's going on. But he is a god, right? And why? I mean, so the easiest and insufficient answer would be that he's not born from a mortal. His mother is killed, and Zeus takes him up, puts him in his knee, and gives birth to him. So there are two that are born, one full-born from the head of Zeus, that's Athena, one born from the knee of Zeus. Knee of Zeus, but we'll see this next time, is this. Oh, that's an article, meaning the, meros. Now, I've mentioned to you before that in the Greek of this time, none of this stuff is there and none of these spaces are there. So you get, the first one would look like this. The second one would be oh, it's not like that, I'm sorry. And the third one would be identical. And so would Homer's name. So, I mean, that's just a detour. That's not an answer to your question. It's just, we have some work to do on figuring out why he's being playful in this way. But I think that it looks as though Dionysus, as though Zeus takes over the role of the mother, and that somehow cancels his human connection. I don't pretend to know what that means, but that's where we would start to think it out. Stupid is a little strong. It's interesting. Bad citizen comes to be not having mind. So it's as though Tiresias is telling him, what you're saying has a kind of spurious, fake rationality to it. You're glib, but in fact, what you're saying shows that you don't understand a thing. So he's in a way agreeing that there is no rational justification for Pentheus to believe that Dionysus is a god. And he's also saying that just shows you how irrational your rationality is. That you are in a way hubristic because you think that you can make things make sense in this very straightforward way. It's interesting, this is very close to the place where Cadmus has said, listen, I know he may not be a god, but what's the harm? So Cadmus's view is a kind of very utilitarian view. It's just another version of what Pentheus does, except a little bit less, a little more sly. But it's still a reasoning procedure, and it's that I think that Tiresias wants to warn him against, that about this you can't reason. Because it's going to turn out that that's what Pentheus stands for. So we don't have a lot of evidence at this point in the play, but it builds up throughout the play that Pentheus stands for the city, once again, the total belief in, you could say, Denos clever, as opposed to Denos uncanny. But you're right to be startled by it, but I think as we work through the play as a whole, we begin to see that that's who Pentheus is. He's the male citizen. He's not an old man like Tiresias and Cadmus. He's the one example of a full citizen we see, and he's meant to stand for that. But we need more to show that that's the case.